Picture this. You're a hotshot Navy pilot, top of your class, and you've just been selected for advanced fighter training. You climb into your cockpit, feeling invincible in your state-of-the-art jet worth tens of millions of dollars. The adrenaline is pumping. This is what you trained for. But then you look across the tarmac, and you see it. A small, sleek fighter that looks almost modest, simple, maybe even outdated. And that's when your instructor tells you something that makes your blood run cold. That little jet over there, that's your enemy today, and it's about to teach you the most humbling lesson of your career. Welcome to the world of the F-5 Freedom Fighter, the aircraft that became America's secret weapon, not by being the biggest, the fastest, or the most expensive, but by being something far more dangerous, the perfect predator hiding in plain sight. The year is 1954, and the Cold War is heating up. The Soviet Union is churning out MiG fighters like there's no tomorrow, spreading them across the globe to allies and client states. America's allies are looking at these threats and panicking. They need fighters, and they need them fast. But here's the problem. American fighters are expensive, really expensive. The latest and greatest jets coming out of U.S. factories cost a fortune, and most of America's allies simply can't afford them. Countries in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, they're all vulnerable, and they're all looking for help. If the United States can't provide affordable air defense, well, there are other offers on the table. Soviet offers. The Pentagon faces a dilemma that would shape military aviation for decades. Do you sell your cutting-edge technology at bargain prices and risk it falling into enemy hands? Or do you create something entirely new, something cheap enough for any ally to buy, simple enough for any air force to maintain, yet deadly enough to hold its own against Soviet aircraft? Most people thought it was impossible. You can't have all three. Cheap, simple, and effective? Pick two, they said. But one company decided to prove everyone wrong. Northrop Aircraft took on the challenge with an almost radical philosophy. Strip away everything that isn't absolutely essential. No fancy radar systems, no complex weapons platforms, no expensive maintenance requirements. Just pure, distilled fighter design. The engineers went back to basics, asking themselves one question over and over. What does a fighter actually need to win a dogfight? The answer was simpler than anyone expected. It needs to be light, maneuverable, and reliable. Everything else, that's just weight. The result was the N-156, which would become the F-5. And when you look at it, really look at it, you realize something striking. It's beautiful in its simplicity. Two small turbojet engines nestled in the fuselage, a slim profile that cuts through the air like a knife, straight wings that sacrifice some speed for incredible maneuverability. This wasn't a jet trying to do everything. This was a jet that knew exactly what it was built for: close-range combat, dogfighting, the kind of warfare where pilot skill matters more than fancy technology. The first prototype flew in 1959, and immediately people started paying attention, not just because it worked, but because of how well it worked for so little money. The F-5 cost about 1/5 the price of other American fighters. 1/5! Suddenly, countries that could never dream of affording modern air defense could field entire squadrons. The Freedom Fighter wasn't just a plane, it was a game changer for military aid strategy. But here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. The U.S. military, the very institution that commissioned this affordable export fighter, started looking at the F-5 with new eyes. Air Force and Navy pilots were training against all sorts of aircraft, trying to prepare for combat against Soviet MiGs. and they kept running into the same problem. American fighters were big, powerful, designed for long-range missile combat. But what if the fight got close? What if the enemy forced a turning battle, a knife fight in the sky? That's when someone had a brilliant and slightly crazy idea. What if we used the F-5 to simulate enemy fighters? Think about it. The F-5 was small and agile, just like a MiG. It was simple to maintain, so you could keep them flying constantly for training. And here's the kicker. It was actually harder to fight than it had any right to be. Pilots who went up against the F-5 in mock combat came back with stories that spread through ready rooms like wildfire. This little jet, this bargain basement fighter that was supposed to be just good enough for export, was absolutely embarrassing pilots in top-of-the-line American aircraft. It could turn tighter, accelerate faster in a dogfight, and its small size made it incredibly difficult to spot and track. The Navy and Air Force created Aggressor squadrons, elite units that would fly the F-5 and use Soviet tactics to train American pilots. These weren't just practice flights, these were full-contact simulations where the aggressors tried their absolute hardest to shoot down the good guys. And they were winning a lot. Pilots assigned to aggressor squadrons became some of the most respected and feared aviators in the military. They knew every trick, every maneuver, every weakness in American fighters because they exploited those weaknesses every single day. One aggressor pilot later described it like this: "Flying the F-5 against modern fighters was like being a lightweight boxer fighting heavyweights. Sure, they hit harder, but you're faster. You can slip under their guard, and by the time they realize where you are, you've already landed 3 punches." The F-5 taught an entire generation of American pilots a lesson they desperately needed to learn. Technology doesn't win dogfights. Tactics and skill win dogfights. Meanwhile, the F-5 was building a reputation overseas that bordered on legendary. Country after country snapped them up. Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Iran, Brazil, Morocco, the list goes on and on. Over 30 countries eventually flew the Freedom Fighter. And they didn't just fly them for show. These jets saw real combat, and they proved their worth over and over again. In Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Air Force flew F-5s against North Vietnamese forces. In the Middle East, various air forces put them through the crucible of modern aerial warfare. And here's the thing that shocked everyone: they held their own. There are documented cases of F-5s taking on more advanced Soviet-built fighters and coming on top. Not because they were better armed or faster, but because they were flown by well-trained pilots who understood the aircraft's strengths. The F-5 forced you to be a better pilot. It didn't have the luxury of firing missiles from miles away. You had to get close. You had to outthink and outfly your opponent. It was old-school aerial combat in a jet age, and it created some of the most skilled fighter pilots in the world. Now, you might be wondering, if this jet was so good, why don't we see it everywhere today? Why isn't it still in frontline service? The answer tells us something important about how warfare evolves. By the 1980s and 90s, air combat was changing. Beyond visual range missiles became more reliable. Radar systems became more sophisticated. Stealth emerged. The future of air combat was moving away from dogfighting and towards long-range engagements, where you could shoot down an enemy before they even knew you were there. In that world, the F-5's greatest strengths, its agility and simplicity, mattered less than advanced sensors and long-range weapons. But here's the twist. Even as the F-5 aged out of frontline combat roles, it found new life in exactly the same role that made it famous decades earlier: aggressor training. To this day, private companies operate F-5s to provide adversary training for military pilots. The U.S. Navy flew F-5s in their Aggressor role until 2024, with some of these jets having more flight hours than aircraft twice their size. Switzerland just retired their F-5s in 2024 after more than 40 years of service. Think about that. A fighter jet designed in the 1950s was still considered valuable enough to keep flying in 2024. There's something almost poetic about the F-5's legacy. It was never meant to be the star. It was meant to be good enough, affordable enough, simple enough. But in being all those things, it became something unexpected. It became the measuring stick by which fighter pilots tested themselves. It became the aircraft that taught humility to cocky aviators who thought their expensive jets made them invincible. It proved that in the hands of a skilled pilot, a simple, well-designed aircraft could be more dangerous than the most advanced technology. The F-5 Freedom Fighter taught the military establishment a lesson that echoes through to today. Sometimes the best solution isn't the most expensive one. Sometimes simplicity is genius. Sometimes the scrappy underdog with nothing to lose is the most dangerous opponent you'll ever face. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly the kind of fighter we needed all along. The one that didn't try to be everything to everyone, but instead did one thing perfectly. It fought. And it won. So the next time you hear about some new fighter jet with a price tag in the hundreds of millions, remember the little jet that could, the F-5 Freedom Fighter. Proof that sometimes the best way to win isn't with the biggest stick, but with the sharpest mind.